Hello, everyone, and welcome to Founders Ascent, the podcast where we talk about books relating to fitness, entrepreneurship, and self-improvement. My name is BJ, and I'm here with Gavin, and we're discussing Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. Gavin, what are your first thoughts about the book?
Overall, I did like this book. It is a pretty quick read. So if you have already read the book, you'll know that it is pretty quick. Good one for that matter. And if you haven't read the book yet, I highly recommend. It is a pretty short read. You could probably finish this in a couple days if you really wanted to. And so without further ado, we're going to get right into it here and talk about what the book is primarily about. It's about, you guessed it, it's about finding meaning within a person's life. And a little background here about Viktor Frankl first is he's a Holocaust survivor. He's lived an insane life with a lot of suffering, and he talks about his experiences in the Holocaust, and a lot of it is essentially his observations of what he saw in an environment where suffering was extremely commonplace with a bunch of other people that he was around. He lost his entire family in the process of this, and as you can only imagine, as someone surviving this, they would have a lot to say about their experiences and of course a lot to learn as a result.
Yeah, and I think one of the more significant things about this story is, so Viktor Frankl survived 4 Holocaust concentration camps, but he's also a professor of neurology and I believe psychology. And so he has a unique perspective on the Holocaust in that he focuses on the psychological impact on the people there. And I think this experience helped develop his earlier work in confirming his theory of logotherapy, which is, there's a great quote from the book that I'm going to pull up here real quick. But logotherapy is essentially all about finding meaning in life. And so here's the quote. It's one of the basic tenets of logotherapy that man's main concern is not to gain pleasure or to avoid pain, but rather to see a meaning in his life. That is why man is even ready to suffer on the condition, to be sure, that his suffering is meaningful. And so despite going through this awful experience, Viktor Frankl believes he was able to survive and maintain sort of the will to live because he believed he had something to live for, which one of those things was sharing his story from a scientific viewpoint of what the Holocaust was like and what impact it had on the people who experienced it. He does start the book by saying in no ways does he view this book as nonfiction or solely factual, but it is his perception of the events and what he thinks they were like as best he can as a observer, but also someone who experienced these things. And that's a really, really unique perspective that I think just is something that makes this book so significant, is you won't be able to find another person in the world who can tell a story like Viktor Frankl.
Yeah, and a good quote from this book that I really liked, and I think this quote sums up the entire book, is he who has a why can bear almost anyhow. I think that quote does the best job summarizing this book because, I mean, it makes sense. Like, we could think about this here logically. If you have something in your life that has purpose, something that has meaning, something to live for, which is your why, you can essentially bear almost anyhow. And Viktor Frankl noticed that the people that survived these concentration camps were the people that had something to live for. And your odds of making it out of this thing were extremely low. And so you had to be an extremely resilient person, and you had to bear almost the most difficult of hows here. And the only way you're going to bear the most difficult of hows is by having a really strong why. And majority of the people that ended up surviving were the ones that had like a loved one, like their wife that they pictured themselves being with happily after the Holocaust was over, or in Viktor's case, his work and wife or something like that. And I guess if you had like a business or something like that, say you're an entrepreneur and you had a business prior to the war here, then maybe your purpose, your why here in this situation could be that company. And so your why should be different for you. I mean, your why is going to be tailored to the individual. And so if you find that why, I think you'll be able to bear a lot more than you think you can.
Yeah, and you keep on saying why, but we've actually discussed this in a former episode, The Alchemist, where we talk about how a person's only real obligation is to discover their personal legend and fulfill it. And that personal legend is sort of what they are supposed to accomplish with their life. It's their meaning, it's their why. And like we saw in The Alchemist, which if you haven't checked out that episode, you should, but it talks about this shepherd who goes on this great adventure and experiences a lot of suffering, war and crossing a desert and dealing with he got beat up and stolen from, and all these different terrible things happened to him. But he had this great personal legend to see the pyramids and find treasure, and so that's what he did, and he was able to cross the desert and do all these great things even as a child because he had this massive why, this massive personal legend. Another great quote, not from this book, but from The Alchemist, is that it's the possibility of having a dream come true that makes life interesting. It's the fact that something could happen that people still live for and work for. I think this quote was in relation to the glass merchant in The Alchemist, who was worried that if he accomplished his dream of going to Mecca, he would have nothing left to live for. And so he preferred to live a life where he's constantly dreaming of going to Mecca, but never actually going to Mecca and never actually achieving it, because once he achieved it, he was worried that there would be nothing left to do. And I think I've experienced this. I really wanted to make the academic decathlon team in high school, and I'd been working on it for all 3 years at the point of my junior year, and then when I was heading into my senior year, I'm like, okay, this is the year I have to make the team. And so I worked really hard at it, and I did. But then I noticed that even after establishing those habits, even after working that hard, once I made the team and we were actually going to the state and region competitions, it was harder for me to study just because I'd already accomplished my goal. I'd completed it. And while I should have refocused and repurposed to try to go further and win state and just do great, it was harder for me to study because I had already accomplished the goal. And so one of the things that I think is useful when sort of setting these goals and establishing the purpose is that once you've established your purpose, once you know what you're going for, you should then refocus not on the purpose, but how are you going to accomplish that purpose? What's the plan? And even better than a plan, create a system so you can achieve whatever that purpose is, not just once, but a great number of times. And when you do that, that's how you scale and do great things. If you say your goal is to buy a Ferrari, how can you buy a Ferrari every day? How hard do you have to work? What do you need to build to get a Ferrari every day? And then build that. And then from there you can accomplish any number of insane things because you're making a couple million every day. But so build the system first, and then from there you'll accomplish your purpose and do great things. It starts with the purpose, but the end result is hopefully a system that allows you to accomplish great things.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good example there with the academic decathlon thing, because once you accomplish that, once you're first place or once you accomplish the thing that you said you were seeking to accomplish initially, I think you'll start to lose motivation.
I'll jump in here, but another great thing, or not great thing, but something to notice, is that how many people have gotten the Nobel Prize twice?
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. Unless your last name is Einstein or Curie, no one. Soon as you now, there's a couple other things, like everyone who gets the Nobel Prize is fairly old, because whatever research you did in your 20s, 30s, 40s, it has to have shown an impact, and that's part of the selection process.
Yeah.
But there's a great book called How to Fly a Horse, which, love the title. It's all about creativity and innovation, and we may add that to our list of books to do. But in that book, it just talks about all these people who accomplish great creative feats. And there's one, it mentions how no one gets the Nobel Prize twice. And the other thing is also there was a screenplay writer who received a ton of awards for all the shows, or he was a director, or he made movies, and his shows got a ton of awards, but he never went to the award ceremonies. He never showed up to them because he said soon as he went there, as soon as he felt that he accomplished something, all his motivation would be done. His goal would be accomplished. And his goal is to write great movies, so he constantly sort of kept away from receiving the reward for writing great movies and just kept on producing them, which makes him one of the best directors or screenplay writers of all time. Wish I remembered his name. But yeah, so there's tons of examples of people losing sort of focus after their purpose disappears. One of them is in this book of a man whose wife died, and that person was like feeling awful and suffering and mourning them, and then Viktor Frankl was like, well, what if you had died first? What would your wife be like? And he was like, oh, she would have felt awful. She would have been in just as much pain, if not more, than I am now. And so Viktor Frankl pointed out, well, isn't it then that you've saved her from that suffering, that this is your sacrifice, that she doesn't have to experience that, but that means you must mourn her and experience this? And after that, he was like, oh. I think he said he shook his hand and just left, that was all he needed to hear, that his suffering had a purpose.
Yeah, I think that's right.
That's just, there are plenty of examples where people, once they achieve their purpose, suddenly they taper off and can't do anything more.
The important thing here too as well is notice how it's tailored to the specific person. Because oftentimes we ask ourselves, like, what's like the meaning of life? Like, what's the purpose of life? As if there's a general broad answer that could be correct to every single person, but that's just not true.
Ridiculous.
Yeah, it's ridiculous to think that. He brings up in this book this whole like chess analogy, and like if I walked up to Magnus Carlsen, the best chess player in the world, and I said, hey, what's the best chess move that I could do? It wouldn't make any sense because it's very context dependent. It depends on what situation you're in. BJ is a chess player, so he's probably like, oh my goodness.
Yeah, I have actually what I think is a decent answer to that question. What's the best chess move? Checkmate. What's the second best chess move? The move that gets you one move away from checkmate.
Yes.
What's the third best check move? The one that gets you two moves away from checkmate.
Yeah.
And so, but then if you ask the question, what's the most important chess move? I would say the most important chess move is a couple moves. It's shaking your opponent's hand, it's resetting up the pieces, and it's playing again. That act of playing again, that's the most important move that all the great players are made of. Just constantly making that move of playing the game again and again. That's what makes that's what makes people in chess oftentimes literally go insane and obsess over the game and do these insane calculations and reach extraordinary heights. It's because they've set up the board again and again. And that's one of the things with chess is that a lot of people can argue like computers are taking away its purpose or whatever. But a lot of all the people who play chess now, computers are helping them reach even higher heights of accomplishments in chess. And so it's maintaining that purpose and constantly having this desire to accomplish things and turning all the roadblocks and all the suffering you may experience into additional purpose that's sort of the central thing that Viktor Frankl talks about, is just constantly figuring out what your purpose is and then working towards that.
And in essence, that's what logotherapy is. It's trying to, or it's searching for and asking those questions for yourself as an individual. What should I be striving for? And you want to do your best to hopefully find that answer. And there are multiple ways to gain meaning within your life. There's a bunch of different ways. And one thing that I want to talk about here, there's 3 different ways. We're going to start off by talking about suffering. And suffering's a difficult one because when you think about it, like, how is suffering going to create meaning or give purpose in my life in any way, shape, or form? Like, I don't know if anyone here has read the David Goggins book. It's called Can't Hurt Me. It's a good one. I've read it, and I want to force BJ to read it so we can get it here on the podcast.
That one's been on our list and moving up in the importance, which with each time Gavin specifies, hey, read this, hey, read this. So we'll get there.
It's a great book, and the thing you need to take away from Goggins' life is how much suffering that guy's went through. He was raised in an abusive household, and after that, he decided to dedicate his life to pretty much suffering again, and he went through like 2.5 hell weeks, and he dedicated himself after that to long distance races, ultra marathons. And at first glance, you could look at that and be like, how is a life like that meaningful? And it is kind of hard to put into words for a specific example like this. And I think the suffering question it's extremely context dependent, because there's a bunch of different kinds of suffering you can go through. There's mental suffering as well as physical suffering. And so when you look at Goggins' life and you say, you know, how is there meaning behind that? I think it's the fact that you're enduring that pain and you're getting to the finish line, and you look back and you say, dang, I didn't know I was capable of doing something like that, which I think is really cool. Another thing about suffering that I want to talk about that BJ and I were talking about earlier was with how the alternative to suffering is pleasure, essentially. And if you only had pleasure, you only experienced pleasure, then suffering, or if you only experienced pleasure, I should say, then there would be no meaning behind this pleasure, right? Because there's no alternative to it. The reason why pleasure has meaning in the first place, the reason why we like pleasure, is because there are alternatives to it, such as pain and suffering. And so that's why I think suffering has meaning to begin with, because it gives pleasure its positivity.
Yeah, and another way to think about this is suffering is how value is determined. It's the fact that things are scarce, that things are difficult to obtain, that makes them valuable. Diamonds are valuable not because they're particularly useful, just because they're scarce and difficult to find. And so if you find them, then lucky you, you're going to be a very rich person. It's things that are easy, like air. Air is essential. But how valuable is it? Well, it takes no suffering to obtain, so it's not valuable at all. So if you want a valuable life, if you want a meaningful life, that probably means you're going to have to go through a lot of suffering, but at the end of it, you're going to have a great story. You're going to accomplish great things, and you hopefully went through that suffering to help other people, and I include helping other people as growing a business and providing a good or service that people find valuable. But, I mean, what great story has zero conflict?
None.
Yeah. If you want to tell a great story, you need to overcome difficult things. It's pleasure and value and everything else exists because of suffering, because of scarcity, because things are difficult to obtain. There's a great quote that if we had utopia, the first thing humans would do was smash it all to bits and break it, just so something interesting happens. Everything we desire, we don't actually desire consistency. We want to work towards consistency, towards sort of pleasure and meaning, the pleasure and consistency, that's the reward for going through suffering. But we don't want to just be handed that. We want to work for it. And that you could say no one wants to work. We have to work. No one wants to. But no, we want, if you break it down and think about all the other alternatives, at the end of the day, we do want to work. We do want to be able to go through suffering and be proud of that accomplishment and receive that award. Personally, this is, I think I have this down just because, so I play Dungeons and Dragons, which is a great game, but one of the things is that there's a main storyteller who sort of controls the universe and helps plan the story, and then there's all the characters that go through it. And that main storyteller, the dungeon master, what he does is he actually, his part of his job is to put the characters through suffering, to plan out challenges and encounters that they have to deal with and create problems for them to solve. And then they get to feel the reward of solving those problems in meaningful ways. There's nothing stopping the dungeon master from being like, hey, you walk on the street and find a pile of gems. Congratulations, you're rich. But then no one wants to play the game. People play the game because, oh, you have to kill the dragon to get the pile of gems. And that's the adventure. That's the story that people want to tell. We don't want to tell stories of just pleasure and nothing else. We want to have the lows and then experience the highs. And so that's sort of the third way that's mentioned of bringing about value or finding meaning in life, is finding meaning in suffering. The second way, we're going to do this backwards, the second way that's mentioned is by encountering someone or experiencing something. And a great example of this is like with chess. If you, some people encounter it and they become obsessed and they work at that, and that's their purpose, that's their meaning, to be a great chess player. But you can encounter art and be like, that's your purpose. You can encounter pretty much anything, but it's going to be personal to you. And then you go after that thing, and that's and if you work at that and that's your true one desire, then if you're the best in the world at anything, you're going to be completely unique and receive a lot of sort of that uniqueness is going to be able to create value, that sort of scarcity. You're the only one in the world. And so that's the second way.
Yeah, and the third way here is essentially going to be creating something, and this could be your work. This example is really good for Viktor Frankl, because I think this was one of his reasons, or one of his whys for making it out of the concentration camps. It was his work, the vision of giving lectures to other people about what his experiences were like, and the observations that he saw, and how the people that essentially made it out were the ones that had those whys. And so having something to live for, like your work or something that you've personally created, can be a great why. I think with entrepreneurship, we could apply this concept here. That's one of the big reasons why I want to pursue entrepreneurship, because it gives you that why. Because creating something, I think, has a lot of meaning. Creating something to make the lives of other people better than when your product or service wasn't around. And so I think, I don't want to speak for BJ, but that's a big reason why I'm doing it.
No, that's a massive motivation. Just having something to work on 80, 100 hours a week, maybe not all the time, but having that thing where you can put that focus, work really hard, experience a lot of suffering, and then see the results and see that scale and compound and great things happen over time, that's really important and meaningful to me. And I guess sort of one last thing we can hit on here is Viktor Frankl talks a lot about his experiences in the Holocaust and how awful they were, but he also mentions that there were some people handing out their bread when they had no food, handing out that very little that they have to other people, and being kind and experiencing their suffering with dignity. There's if you know Naval Ravikant, he tells the story of he's an entrepreneur and investor, and he invested in this company, and it didn't do very well. And the person who was running the company, he could have cut out the investors at any time and just ditched all of them. But instead, he kept on dumping more of his own personal money into the idea until the business eventually did succeed. And Naval was really impressed and appreciated that he didn't cut out the investors when he could have. And the guy was like, no, of course I wouldn't do that. That's not necessarily for you, that's for me. I want to feel decent about myself. I want to feel like I've behaved honestly, and I don't want to feel guilty in the end. And so I'm going to behave kind and fairly with other people. And I think that's a good choice from a moral and ethical standpoint. I think that's a good choice from a psychological standpoint. And I think that's a good business choice. Because if you're constantly demonstrating you're a person you can trust, that you take care of the people who trust you, and that you are just a good person to work with, those relationships are going to compound, and you'll become the person in your community that at anytime anyone has an entrepreneurial idea or they want to make something good happen, you're the person they go to because you're a good person to do business with. And you'll get the best deals, and people will respect you more, and you'll build this great thing. But but that's really shown when people are going through suffering. In the easy times, it's easy to be whatever you want. But when people go through suffering, that's when the real character is shown. Viktor Frankl says that separates the swines from the saints. As a lot of the prisoners were worse to their fellow prisoners than the Guards, because the Guards gave them a higher status and more food or whatever to become sort of that sort of jailer mentality, even as a prisoner themselves. And so that's sort of the message I'm going to end off here with, I think. But that's, when you're dealing with suffering, the number one most important thing is that you bear that suffering honorably and decently. Any failure you experience in the suffering, that's fine. But any sort of undecent or indecent behavior towards other people, that's going to be a stain that is going to be hard to remove. So bear your suffering well.
In talking about morals there and being kind to other people, I think this also has parallels to David Goggins' book as well. He talks about, in the book Can't Hurt Me, during Hell Week, he talks about, well, when you ask yourself, what kind of people make it through Hell Week? Like, ask yourself, like, seriously, what kind of people are the people that can endure a week straight of pain?
For those who don't know, maybe tell them what this is. Just a recommendation.
Yeah, so Hell Week is training that you go through prior to becoming a Navy SEAL, which is one of the hardest things you could put yourself through. Hell Week is a week straight of exercising, team battles, team competitions amongst each other, and it's probably one of the most physically and mentally grueling things you could put your body through. They're doing it on no sleep, and they're doing it, I believe it's in California, on the beach there, and a lot of them go in the water and stuff, and hypothermia is something that they have to deal with.
How is this not categorized as torture?
They signed themselves up for this.
Oh, okay.
But anyway, if you ask yourself, what are the kinds of people that make it through Hell Week? Because not many people make it through Hell Week to begin with. So ask yourself, seriously, what are the kinds of people that make it through that? And what you'll find is the kinds of people that make it through this week-long, grueling training are the ones that are team players. They're the kind of people that pick up slack for other people that are really going through it. They're the kind of people that will give away part of their food when one of their crew members is hungry. They're not the kind of people that are only in it for themselves. They're not the kind of people that are extremely greedy and are the most self-serving people you can think of. They're the team players. They're the people that are going to help you when you're extremely tired or when it's very common for Hell Week if you like break a bone or something like that. And so they're the kind of people that will help you if you're going through an injury like that or something. And I think this kind of has parallels to what BJ was talking about with the kind of person that gets through the Holocaust, like the kind of person that gives bread to another person or something like that because they don't have much food there. And so I really liked reading that part because it made me think of that. And so, yeah, just kind of wrapping up here, I wanted to say that the main thing that I've taken away from this book in particular was the person that has a why can bear almost any how. And I think the how here that Viktor Frankl brings up is probably one of the most hard, grueling hows you could think of, which is the Holocaust. And so if you have a why that's strong enough, I think regardless of what the how is, I think you'll be fine.
And I think you should also take this into account with who you surround yourself with. There's a great Gary Vee quote that what you were talking about reminded me of with people who aren't in it for themselves and who help their crew members who make it through the training. The Gary Vee quote is, remember, A+ human beings with B- skills always beat A+ talent with C- personality and attitude. And that I think his name is Simon Sinek.
Yeah, Simon Sinek.
Sinek, yes. He has said a similar thing as well, that in the selection process for Navy SEALs, they'll take lesser talent but better attitude over the best talents but the worst attitude. It's because the overall result of that attitude on the team is a net negative versus all the talents and skills they provide. And so, sort of wrapping this up, finding your purpose in your suffering, finding people who behave honorably, trustworthy, high energy, hardworking, and who have the right attitude for what you're trying to do and help you become better, and recognizing suffering potentially as a good thing that creates value, that allows you to tell a great story. These are all things that we found in Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. Check out the book. It's a quick read. Thank you so much for listening. If you made it this far, leave a like, leave a comment, subscribe. Tell us what we can do better. Tell us what you liked about it. Just say hi. We love hearing from you guys. And we'll see you next week, Tuesday, 12 p.m. Don't be late.
Bye, everybody.